Hallo? Ja. Herzlich willkommen hier in der Kunsthalle Baden-Baden. Wir freuen uns alle sehr. Dass Sie hier sein können heute zu dem außergewöhnlichen Vortrag von Louis Chude-Sokei. Sein Vortrag Tresholds on Migrant Listening. Zu Louis Chude-Sokeis Werken gehören die preisgekrönten wissenschaftlichen Arbeiten The Last Darky, The Sound of Culture und die von der Fachpresse hochgelobten Memoiren Floating in a Most Peculiar Way. Er ist Professor für Englisch und Direktor des Studienprogramms African American and Black Diaspora Studies an der Boston University. Er ist außerdem Chefredakteur von The Black Scholar, der ersten Zeitschrift für Black Studies in den Vereinigten Staaten und Gründer des Klangkunst- und Archivprojekts Echolocution. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass er heute hier sein kann und dass wir seinem Vortrag Tresholds on Migrant Listening lauschen können. Dear Louis, thank you very much for coming here. We're very happy to welcome you and we're all very curious about your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Can you hear me okay? It's a very boomy room. Yeah. It's up to you. I can hear myself. So you hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, all good. So this is what happens when you do a lecture inside of an installation. All good? All right, thank you, folks. I'm going to just share some ideas with you from a number of different sources. Got it? All right. But I'll start by sharing with you the text of an installation that I was really pleased to be able to place at the doorway at the House of World Cultures, Hackaway, in Berlin, for a festival that was called The Sound of Distance, that was curated by our very own Jan St. Werner in 2021. The piece is called Thresholds, and it was what greeted the audiences as they came into the institution, as they went in and out of the festival. It was my voice broadcast through a series of speakers in and outside of the main doorway, echoed, delayed, distorted, dubbed, basically. Now later on in my set, I'm going to actually play the track, right? But I want to begin this talk by reading it because the set later on and this talk are two halves of the same coin with space synthesis as a crucial node that links them together, as is the music of dub itself, which is central to all aspects of my work. Those of you unfamiliar with dub, you will become quite familiar with it by the end of this evening. Jan and I have never spoken in detail about the influential sound art piece I Am Listening in a Room by Alvin Lucier, in which the artist records himself saying, I am listening in a room. He records it into the room, plays it back into the room, and saturates the recording with feedback. We haven't talked about it, but that's a shared common connection there for us, as is a shared obsession or connection to dub, which is a music that's obsessed with echoes. Because to be obsessed with echoes is to be obsessed with space itself. I want to offer the piece Threshold here as a kind of useful opening to my ideas about sound and space and this broader exhibition, which links me to Jan in a number of ways because he was the collaborator on Thresholds, but it resonates with the larger project of finding new ways to move through space by heightening our attention to sound, to listening. And in my work, race, migration are very much connected to listening and culture. So let me read from the piece for a second. We move through doorways too quickly. The only time we take them seriously is during earthquakes, when they are safer even than desks or tables, as the comforts of certainty crumble, shake, and shatter. Doorways, however, are more than load-bearing structures or obligatory demarcations. If we pay attention to our motion through doorways, it is possible to acknowledge a shift in pressure, sometimes sound, because space, even to the blind and the deaf, makes clear its distinction from other spaces. On the skin, certainly in the ear. This is because doorways divide space, but also prepare us for space. And the ear translates the outside inside, rendering space intimate, giving emptiness character. This is why migration is also an act of listening. Doorways are physical markers of transition. However, it is likely that only immigrants remember this, or those for whom place is either traumatic memory or hesitant aspiration. This might be why in such houses, doorways may be decorated with small tokens and reminiscences of paths taken and not images of those left behind, lost in the undertow, or receipts of money sent home. Some cultures decorate their walls in powerful expressions of ownership or belonging. For those who may have been crippled or rendered timid by migration, doorways are a fold in space and time, a way station for those who know how easy it is to disappear or to never, ever arrive. In such households, you might find icons of worship on or in their doorways, of Dambala, for example, from Haitian voodoo, the god who governs gates, fences, entryways. Dambala is often associated with another god, Legba. Legba speaks all languages. Legba is a translator who haunts or guards the crossroads. Papa Legba is actually a representation of the Catholic St. Peter. St. Peter is the gatekeeper or the doorway man of heaven. In houses like these, transition is sacred. Home is just a deep breath between movement and types of speech. Doorways imply arrival, and requires performance. To those who have forgotten or erased their own migrations, the arrival of others can be enjoyed as spectacle. Doorways, then, are stages where the murmur or crisis of voices or sounds in the next room tremble the skin and shorten your breath. Think of your actions as you enter a room. How do you prepare? Your hands may remove stray dust. You may raise your trousers to straighten the folds of your skirt. Deepen your breath in anticipation. Suck in your gut. You may moisten your lips, inhale sharply, or clear your throat. These behaviors are common because doorways shape behavior. Women cover their stomachs upon crossing the threshold and prepare to be smaller. Men expand their chests and widen their shoulders. Here, migration meets myths of gender. Doorways end where performance meets judgment. That's the piece from the installation, right? Now, the goal of the sound of distance was to transform Hakadha into a large resonating instrument, to basically play the building, using space as both subject, object, and material, right? In my early conversations with Jan about it, I described it in a conversation as dubbing a room or dubbing a building, again connected to Jamaican dub music. Dodo Nkishi and Tunde Alibaba, who just did the wonderful percussion, right? They also participated in that festival, adding to the levels of connectivity, right? So none of this should seem alien as we think about space synthesis, Space Synthesis is a unique exhibition, but it's also a crucial node in the ongoing exploration of sound and space that Jan St. Werner has been pursuing for some time. Thresholds, as I read to you, is obviously about space, moving through a house, a building, but also encountering the world through it. It is about passages, tunnels, and about how space gives rise to meanings, particularly from culture to culture, ethnic group to ethnic group, and how communities in motion make home within spaces that are often inhospitable and often incarcerate or expel them. After all, to speak of space is to speak also of borders. Thresholds is about how these migrants, refugees, marginal people, and artists make space into other space, shaping space into nooks, crannies, corners, exulting in its shadows and its distortion. Thresholds is also rooted in one of my primary concerns, which is that just as we can say different groups of people, social classes, and cultures, we could say that they see things differently. I'm interested in, can we then say that they hear things differently, right? What does culture sound like? How do different groups privilege different elements in the sonic field? These sonic fields, these differences, must speak to specific tensions, tragedies, memories. This is at the root of my work, which is called echolocution, which I'll say something about in a short while. It's certainly inspired by interest in echoes, but echoes as a product of space and sound. I'm interested in how space speaks. Can space speak? Hopefully, as I say these things, you're seeing a connection with what's going on with space synthesis, right? Now, what I did for Hakaveh was actually a small fragment of a larger piece, right? It's a still incomplete piece about how different cultures engage space through the built environment. For them, these different groups, a house might as well be a city or a nation. These are people for whom place is precarious. As I said, space is in this context wed to sound, which means that movement, which is something I enjoy with this piece, movement is an acoustic phenomenon, right? What I'd like to do now, though, is read the rest of that piece. Still incomplete, but I offer it as a gift to you, Jan, because I know you've never heard it. In fact, no one has ever heard the whole piece. So, back to Thresholds. Egyptians may have used doors the earliest. They can at least be credited with identifying doors as a distinct mode of entry and egress. It was the Romans, though, who would turn doorways into a religious thing by naming a deity particular to them, Janus, keeper of doors and archways. Janus was not alone in his responsibilities. St. Augustine famously mocked the Roman commitment to a multiplicity of deities, since Janus shared space with Cardia. Cardia was the goddess of the hinge that held the door. Or Limentus, the god of the threshold itself, and Forculus, protector of doors. Though perhaps reflective of Catholicism's hostility to difference or its relentless claiming of the universal, this variety is not trivial, it is heretical. Rendering doorways sacred means that the Romans may be responsible for a history of hackneyed and cheesy symbolism, particularly those based on dualities. Here, there, in, out, darkness, light, knowledge, ignorance. One could argue that this is why Janus has two faces, not just looking forward and backwards to the past and the present, like the Sankofa bird, crucial to the Akan people of Ghana, but perhaps Janus is actually a god of endless repetition, the god of cliché. Though famously impatient with symbols and pantheism, Islam also has a rich history of doorways. The religion's architecture and design are known for richly patterned, highly ornate passageways. Each doorway or arch echoes or signifies the 8 doors of Jannah that lead to the final dwelling place of the righteous. But though historically related to arches, doorways in America are similar only in function but not meaning. America has never been keen on sanctifying thresholds as Europeans, for whom the arch remains a source of historical power and place, nor have they been as intent on the promise of the divine as Islam. In America, a nation obsessed with acceleration, doorways are simply too brief a passage to bear the weight of meaning, however secular. That reluctance to render doorways sacred may be evidence of a country eager to erase movement and transition entirely, particularly because it is associated with vulnerability, incompletion, its own huddled immigrant masses. This is not to suggest that American doorways are without deliberate symbolism. Crucifixes go above doorways. Easter palm wreaths go above doorways. Mistletoes, clocks. But for this country's residents, beginnings are not about movement, migration, or transition. Americans are prejudiced towards larger open spaces. They turn to face outside, imagining always infinity. Such people cherish space, build myths around it, only to expand it more. Space for them is promiscuous. It begets more space, because for them, expanse is a promise. Doorways to them sanctifies permanence and closure. Unlike the Jews, there is no blood on these structures, no Passover. Americans have no longer arrived. They prefer to always have been there. At this point, you might suspect that there's a word for all of this in Japan. Perhaps even an aesthetic like wabi-sabi or zen, ideas that are suitable to marketing for Westerners looking for philosophies that absolve them without the burdens of Judeo-Christian guilt. Ma, the Japanese concept, comes close. Negative space, transitory emptiness, gap. But the term is imprecise in ways that doorways are not, depending as they do on physical movement and bodies. Just the sound of that, ma, is just a syllable, an incomplete word, always open. But ma does not identify what is ultimately more important about doorways and their here and there, inside and out dualities, or the motion in between, or the fact that thresholds hold up the very structures of a house that can then make the doorway invisible. Neither Ma or all histories of transition can identify that moment of revelation, which is the drama of arrival itself, as merely the echo of exile and displacement. Thanks for your indulgence. I read that because I wanted Jan to hear the whole thing. As you can hear from the piece, it's really about how homes, rooms, and spaces have always been rich with cultural meanings all over the world, right? My interest is the doorway. In fact, as I moved through space synthesis, I just stood in every doorway so I could hear the sounds bleeding in back and forth, right? So back to space, though, the politics of space for me. Given how complex space is as a sphere of power and knowledge, who owns it, who controls it, who places borders around it, who can cross those borders? This piece, Thresholds, is focused on making clear how even our most intimate homes link us to the widest possible political, cultural, artistic, and religious meanings. But the piece didn't just come out of nowhere. It came from our conversations, right? But the broader concerns of space migration, race, sound, and listening that comes out of the Echolocution project. And if you'll give me a minute, I'll just say a few words about that. Right. Broadly speaking, the project appeared, I created it, as a response to various artists, critics, activists, and scholars who are engaging national projects of memorialization, particularly around issues of race, empire, and trauma. Some of you should be familiar with this, with the politics of decoloniality, right? It ranges from the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in South Africa, then it hit the West with great impact, and the eruption of all of these resistant movements that were focused on tearing down monuments, right? Restoring artworks back to their original owners, right? Also to the revising of educational curricula, right? To debates around reparations, right? Paying people back for stolen art, etc. All of these attempts were there to confront history by way of its public representations as manifest in architecture, monuments, the built environment, right? Archives, museums. Now, as a scholar of colonialism and race, it seemed a remarkable moment to me where history took hold of the masses, particularly those who felt continually victimized by history, right? And it forced the public to engage in ways that only scholars had and artists had been doing for some time. The decolonial movement continues to be very interesting and energetic, primarily because it's looking at the built environment, monuments, buildings, museums, and trying to either change them, tear them down, reimagine them. It's certainly happening throughout the United States and Europe, right? And from what I know about Germany, it's happening here as well, right? However, and this is why I decided to focus on ecolocution, these various attempts at historical restitution or critique, or even vandalism as a political act, they were focused on visual media or architecture. This is understandable given the primacy of the visual in Western culture, right? But also the primacy of the visual in state memorialization, which leaves texts and traces, buildings, flags, statues, artifacts, monuments. Important, but very visual, material, right? History and memory, however, are more than just visual traces, artifacts, statues, real estate. As are nations and traumas. They are experiential, they are psychological, they're immaterial, but they're embodied, just like space. So I began to wonder, well, why don't we more formally archive sounds and ambiances in tandem with the visual record? Why don't we just record how things sound in addition to what they look like, right? Why don't we engage the range of sonic techniques available to us now in the digital realm to fully flesh out historical memory, right? This could deepen our experience and connection to complex, difficult pasts, but more interestingly, they could lead us to create monuments in and of sound. Sonic monuments, right? And so the work of ecolocution focused on sound, because as music has taught us, memory is susceptible to sound, just as sound is susceptible to silence. Therefore, history must be subject to listening, particularly to echoes and traces, decay, distortion, static, not only in the world, but also in the archives of official and unofficial memory. For me, this began with listening, not just to neutral or pastoral spaces, but it began with me listening to buildings and spaces that bear the weight of historical crime and traumatic transformations. Listening to places that we have fled, or places that you have invaded. Places that have already marked and shaped us. Places that we like to forget, but that still haunt us. Places and spaces we do not know what to do with. Listening to ruins. As the great field recordist Chris Watson once said, a quote that I use almost every day, events haunt spaces. Another way of saying that is history contaminates space, right? And in my mind, there is no greater or more powerful way of experiencing haunting, contamination, place, space, and history than by listening. Listening is a posture that generates an awareness of time, space, but here's where it gets tricky. Listening doesn't necessarily generate fact or argument. This latter point is crucial for me because sound enables a profound questioning of what history does or what history is meant to be, because listening to space, even moving through here, listening to space, even politically charged spaces, if you listen long enough, you experience a kind of profound placelessness, right? Right? The more you listen to something, to a space, you get this strange ambiguity. It's not ambivalent, but it can be troubling for people who insist that history and memory be clearly and exclusively on their side, right? Especially in our politically charged ideological moment, it's important to identify that there is no such thing as innocent listening, right? And even though music can be culturally claimed by one group or the other, sound cannot be owned. Sound itself does not demarcate clear positions or borders. Sound is always in tension with conventional memories and ideologies because sound is always about something else. Sound is always about someone else. Sound is promiscuous. And that's why I speak more about sound than I speak about music. Music, we can start talking about who does it belong to, who does it mean, what does it mean. Sound is promiscuous. Borders mean nothing to sound. This is why sound can and always will betray even those who claim it as their own. And for me, that is fascinating. And for me, and Jan, we bond on that. Right. But let's talk briefly about space as I move to an end. Space is not empty or immaterial. Sound travels differently in different temperatures. I know this is a field recorder. Different temperatures generate different sounds, right? Due to humidity and types of atmosphere. What this means is that not only do sounds vary from place to place, silence varies from place to place. Silence is always different, right? Sound enters the body differently depending on your location. It reverberates differently. Microphones, to get technical, they operate differently from place to place. Echo and reverb, for example, or even equalization differs from place to place to place, right? These technical insights led me to explore the cultural effects of those differences. Not only in terms of how people from different cultures and areas produce sound, music, language, etc., but how they relate to space and memory. How do different people listen? How have they historically listened? This includes silences too. Do different cultures and groups have different notions of silence, just as we know they have different conceptions of and tolerations of different types of noise, how they define noise differently. I wanted to know what do we learn if we listen to spaces, monuments, buildings, ruins, dense with political, historical, and ideological meaning, and after subjecting these spaces to listening, what if we take those sonic materials, ambiances, silences, differences in noise, and use them historically and create monuments or create ways of remembering the past through sound? What does history sound like then? But this kind of listening, it is suffused with a suspicion of dominant and conventional meanings. Clearly it was familiar to me, indeed appealing to me as an immigrant. Some of my colleagues would like to call this a fugitive kind of listening. I'd rather link it to my immigrant past, my immigrant cultural background, because as an immigrant, my listening and the listening I hope to encourage is attuned to echoes and cracks and fissures, right? It comes from people who live and hear in the ruins of monuments, in the traces of cultures, fantasies of stasis, people who live in a world shaped by endless memories of loss and those that we left behind. What does that do to our listening? Right? So listening to spaces overdetermined with world historical meanings, artistic ones, political ones. For example, like Nuremberg, I bring that up because Michael and Jan and I, we were involved in a project where we spent over 2 years listening to the Nuremberg ruins, right? We just completed that last week or so. When you're listening like that, people expect you to be direct in your approach and unambiguous, right? Here is what history is. Here is what it did. You're expected to have a more strident militancy, which is more associated with the decolonial movements going on right now. But that's not what listening does. It's not the kind of listening we do, right? In the midst of these intense polarities of ideological arguments and positions, amidst the endless recurrence of prejudice and fascism, monuments and ruins, the kind of listening that I want to celebrate is an ambiguous listening, because that ambiguous listening can be political. Because that kind of listening, it dwells in the thresholds, right? And the threshold is what enables transition and transformation. It is what we find in the gateways, or as we know from the music of the blues, the crossroads, right? The threshold is no answer to our problems, but at least it is the space where all realities, worlds, and possibilities meet, blend, and blur. Thank you. Do we do questions and this sort of thing? Yes. Say more about it. Yeah. As a person who's a writer and a scholar, the visual and the literary for me are really identified closely with arguments and things that are fixed, that you have to unsettle and debate, right? Listening for me is a little bit more promiscuous. Yes, you can listen with ideological concerns and frame things based on your expectations, right? But if you allow yourself to really let those things go, and it's easier to let those things go with listening, because sound is all over the place, right? Sound belongs as much to, the sound I'm making right now, who does it belong to? Exactly. That's what I mean by promiscuous, right? And so I could claim that it's my voice, but I can't claim that it's my meaning or that I own it, right? And so sound, right, because of that physical property of sound, it allows us, I think, to be a little bit more ambiguous and open to different kinds of possibility. Open. Yes. And even if you are judgmental, you're not going to win, because it's still the room. It's still the room. Does that get it? Yes.
I would like...
It's just for you.
Literally no empty promise in the whole talk. There was no empty promise. The whole speech made sense in terms of understanding how we hear. But back to this sonic monument thing.
Yes.
I'm a migrant too, and
Yeah.
I mostly live in other histories and with other monuments.
Yes.
Within other language. So, and monumentalization is also very problematic. Can we also think of sonic anti-monument or sonic document? Maybe the way you approach to the migrant through listening can also lead us to share space not as a permanent monument with a hero, but maybe more temporalities that we share. Maybe.
I see what you're saying, because for you the word monument suggests a kind of, even sonically, I understand that. I'll tell you a little story about this though. The people that I come from I was born in Nigeria, and I'm the Biafra. It's a nation that no longer exists. Millions of my family and people were all killed, right? They still exist in Nigeria, but there is no monument to Biafra. And you're actually not allowed politically to create a physical monument to Biafra. And there are other peoples in the world who are not allowed to create physical monuments. So I wonder, what about a sonic one? What about virtual ones, right? And so I began to open up the possibility of different kinds of monuments. But I agree with you, the word monument suggests a kind of, that one may not want to celebrate. Yes, yeah. And so I decided, because of my connection to the Biafra movement, I thought, well, this is kind of a loophole, right? And what if we can create a monument that is not physical, but is still deeply moving and impactful, with the voices of the dead and the memories of the past, because technologically we can do that now. If we move from the visual into the space of the sonic, the virtual, we can create huge monuments. They don't have to be huge, they could be all kinds of monuments, and that's what I'm opening up to. So it would be both monument and anti-monument. So thank you for that.
It might be also a personal question. What does the threshold do with the notion of home? What does the threshold, what does it do with the notion of home? Like,
that's one of the reasons I focus on migrant people who are always in the threshold, always migrating. And I think of the writers and the thinkers that inspired me. These are writers and thinkers that said, you know something? One day we will all be migrants. One day none of us will have homes for lots and lots of different reasons. And so they begin to think about a permanent space of migrating from space to space. And so thresholds for people who are, as I've said a number of times, people who are, space is precarious, place is an aspiration, right? Well, then the threshold becomes the only way to document your movement through space and time, because you don't have a home. As I said in the thresholds piece, those who have homes, they get walls. They have floors. They have ceilings. Those of us who are migrants, and this is our permanent state of being, not necessarily anticipating ever having a home, but creating a home in motion. Thresholds are a way of documenting that you were there and that you will continue to move through space. Does that answer?
thank you, it's very inspiring.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I'm really interested in this idea of sonic decolonization and echolocution.
And I'm really interested in your glasses. Those are great. They're truly cool. Those I love them.
The thresholds to blindness, exactly. And so, can you give an example? Like, how can I think of it when I'm trying to get, like, I've seen that the monuments come down and the statues come down. How can we think about that in sound? Well, no, I'm thinking of, I'm thinking of the memorials being a form of decolonization if we're thinking in the realm of sound.
What would it be?
Yeah, what would it be like?
Yeah, one of the things that I'm hoping to do is, and actually doing, it's great working with Jan and other people, is bringing architects and archivists into the conversation, because I'm not an architect, right? But for example, I'll give you one thing that I'm pursuing. Those of you in here who know music production, you're familiar with convolution reverb, right? Convolution reverb is a way in which you could digitally recreate the sonic characteristics of the space by recording that echo, right? That's used right now for music. For example, if I'm doing a really cool drum beat, and I want my snare to sound like it's inside the Sistine Chapel, I can now download the Sistine Chapel. It's not a joke, it's true. It's actually quite easy now, right? This room can be easily digitally uploaded and then downloaded to put on your bass guitar, right? So it's so common. I'm like, well, why don't we do that to capture cultural spaces, cultural ambiances, actual places. Now, people are doing it in India and different parts of the world. I think we should do more of that and build from there, right? That would be a monument, right? Sonic virtuality, you enter into a space through listening that really produces kinds of meaning. The thing is, I'm looking at hopefully a younger generation who are much more adept at this stuff, to just sort of take up this idea and say, well, in the same way, it's the worst parallel. Imagine if meta, right, the metaverse was interesting. Right? Imagine the technology that produces that, but being used for broader cultural and political significance in terms of capturing the Biafra movement and the people who are gone and the spaces that are sacred to the people, but they can't even utter it because they were wiped out. Does that give you a sense of it? So I think that there are a lot of possibilities from convolution reverb to virtuality, and considering that archives and museums take space, right? It'll be interesting to see folks imagining other possibilities, especially since we're facing one of the next great migrations in American world culture is the large migration online, right? What happens then in terms of creating alternate kind of cultural possibilities? Does that help? Yeah, thank you. Well, all right. Thank you for your time, folks.